Hearing of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee is called to order. The committee meets today to consider the externality costs of the United States' dependence on fossil fuels. The gasoline price spikes following Katrina and Rita hurricanes underscored for Americans the tenuousness of short-term energy supplies. Since these events, there is a broader understanding that gasoline and home heating prices are volatile and can rapidly spike to economically damaging levels due to natural disasters, terrorist attacks, or other world events. But as yet there is not a full appreciation of the hidden costs of oil dependence to our economy, our national security, our environment, and our broader international goals. Today, with the help of experts who have thought a great deal about these issues, we will attempt to more clearly define some of these costs. We're cognizant this is a difficult and imprecise exercise. We're also aware that most, if not all, energy alternatives have some externality costs. But we're starting from the presumption that if we blindly ignore our dependence on foreign oil, we are inviting an economic and national security disaster. With less than 5% of the world's population, the United States consumes 25% of its oil. If oil prices remain around $60 a barrel through 2006, we will spend approximately $320 billion on oil imports this year. Most of the world's oil is concentrated in places that are either hostile to American interests or vulnerable to political upheaval and terrorism. More than 3/4 of the world's oil reserves are controlled by national oil companies. And within 25 years, the world will need 50% more energy than it does now. Now, these basic facts demand a major reorientation of the United States policy aimed at reducing the United States' dependence on fossil fuels. Our goals must be to mitigate the short-term costs of our dependence on oil while pursuing energy alternatives that would reduce the international leverage of petro superpowers, improve environmental quality, cushion potential oil price shocks, stimulate new high-tech energy industries, and ground the American economy on energy sources that will neither run out nor be cut off by a foreign supplier. There are at least 6 basic threats associated with our dependence on fossil fuels. First, oil supplies are vulnerable to natural disasters, to wars and terrorist attacks that can produce price shocks and threats to national economies. This threat results in price instability and forces us to spend billions of dollars defending critical fossil fuel infrastructure and choke points. Second, over time, finite fossil fuel reserves will be stressed by the rising demand caused by explosive economic growth in China, India, and many other nations. This is creating unprecedented competition for oil and natural gas supplies that drives up prices and widens our trade deficits. Maintaining fossil fuel supplies will require trillions in new investment, much of it in unpredictable countries that are not governed by democracy and market forces. Third, energy-rich nations are using oil and natural gas supplies as a weapon against energy-poor nations. This threatens the international economy and increases the risk of regional instability and even military conflict. Fourth, even when energy is not used overtly as a weapon, energy imbalances are allowing oil-rich regimes to avoid democratic reforms and insulate themselves from international pressure and the aspirations of their own people. In many oil-rich nations, oil wealth has done little for the people, while ensuring less reform, less democracy, fewer free market activities, and more enrichment of elites. It also means that the United States and other nations are transferring billions of dollars each year to some of the least accountable regimes in the world. Some of these governments are using this money to invest abroad in terrorism, in instability, or demagogic appeals to anti-Western populism. Fifth, reliance on fossil fuels contributes to environmental problems, including climate change. In the long run, this could bring drought, famine, disease, and mass migration, all of which could lead to conflict and instability. Sixth, our efforts to facilitate international development are often undercut by the high costs of energy. Developing countries are more dependent on imported oil, their industries are more energy intensive, and they use energy less efficiently. Without a diversification of energy supplies that emphasizes environmentally friendly options that are abundant in most developing countries, the national incomes of energy-poor nations will remain depressed, with negative consequences for stability, development, disease eradication, and terrorism. Each of these threats comes with a short and long-term cost structure. As a result, the price of oil dependence for the United States is far greater than the price consumers pay at the pump. Some costs, particularly those affecting the environment and public health, are attributable to oil, no matter its source. Others, such as costs of military resources dedicated to preserving oil supplies, stem from our dependence on oil imports. But each dollar we spend on securing oil fields, borrowing money to pay for oil imports, or cleaning up an oil spill is an opportunity missed to invest in a sustainable energy future. Certain types of costs are extremely difficult to quantify, and we understand that many national security risks are heightened by our dependence. But how, for example, would we assign a dollar figure to Iran's use of its energy exports to weaken international resolve to stop its nuclear weapons program? Yet we should do our best to quantify the externality costs of oil so we have a clearer sense of the economic and foreign policy trade-offs that our oil dependence imposes upon us. As the U.S. government and American business consider investments in energy alternatives, we must be able to compare the cost of these investments with the entire cost of oil, and public acknowledgement of the billions of dollars we spend to support what the President has called our, quote, oil addiction, end of quote, would shed new light on investment choices related to cellulosic ethanol, the hybrid cars, alternative diesel, and other forms of energy. Now, as we address these questions today, we'll have the benefit of a distinguished panel of experts. Dr. Hilliard Huntington is the Executive Director of the Energy Modeling Forum at Stanford University. He is a Senior Fellow and past President of the United States Association for Energy Economics. He recently coordinated 2 studies funded by the Department of Energy that evaluated the economic risks of oil price shocks. Mr. Milton Kopulis is the President of the National Defense Council Foundation. He has advised Secretaries of Defense, Energy, and Interior, and was a member of the National Petroleum Council. He is widely published on military affairs and has devoted much study to the military expenditures associated with ensuring the flow of oil. Dr. Gary Yohe is the John E. Andres Professor of Economics at Wesleyan University. Professor Yohe is widely published on the adaptation and mitigation of climate change. He recently edited Avoiding Dangerous Climate Change, the collection of papers on the subject that were prepared for last year's G8 summit. We welcome these 3 distinguished witnesses. We look forward to their insights. First of all, I would like to recognize my colleague, Senator Hagel, for any opening thought or comment he might have this morning.
Mr. Chairman, thank you. I do not have a statement. I look forward to listening to our witnesses. I think your focus on this issue at this time is not only appropriate and relevant, but one of the critical challenges that faces our country and the world over the next 25 years. So thank you for your attention to this, and I thank as well our witnesses for giving us their expertise and time.
Well, thank you very much, Senator Hagel. I'll ask the witnesses to testify in the order that I introduced you. First of all, that would be, well, I think the list that I have on our agenda is different than the one I introduced you. But we will start with Mr. Kopulis, then Dr. Huntington, and then Dr. Yohe. Let me just say at the outset that your full statements will be made a part of the record so that you need not ask for permission that that occur. It will. And please either give the statements or summarize as you wish. We will not have a a rigid time limit. We've come to hear you. We want to hear your testimony, then have opportunities to raise questions. Mr. Coughlin.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Bear with me. One of the two signs of advancing age is to eat more than one pair of glasses. The other is Barbara spends more time on your ears than on the top of his head. As you know, I'm Bill Markovic. I'm president of the National Defense Council Foundation. I would like to thank Chairman Lugar for giving me the opportunity to speak with the committee today, and I would also like to commend him for his leadership in addressing our nation's perilous energy dependence. He gets it, and that's important, because what he gets is that America is rushing headlong into a disaster that threatens to leave us with the Hobson's choice between economic calamity and world resource war. What's worse, it's a disaster of our own design. Like Pogo said, we have met the enemy and they is us. More than 3 decades have passed since the 1973 OPEC embargo first warned us about our vulnerability to imported oil, and yet nothing substantial has been done. As bad as things were then, the emerging economies of China, India, and Eastern Europe are increasing competition for scarce resources, making the situation even worse. Indeed, by the year 2025, the world will need an additional 40 million barrels of oil per day. And the simple fact is, it's not there to be found from conventional resources. But it's not just the physical shortfall that's the problem. It's also the problem of the instability of many of our sources. Out of our 6 top suppliers, 4, Saudi Arabia, Venezuela, Nigeria, and Iraq, which supply 38.2% of our imports, 22.6% of total production, are of at least questionable reliability. Given the situations in these countries, it's virtually certain that sometime within the next 3 to 5 years, there will be an oil supply disruption. And unlike the disruptions of the past, the consequences could be far, far more severe. We estimated that the oil supply disruptions of the 70s cost this nation between $2.3 and $2.5 trillion. And I should note that Oak Ridge National Lab places the estimate at $4 trillion, so if anything, we're conservative. However, the next oil shock, because of our higher dependence, because of our higher use, could cost this nation $8 trillion, almost 2/3 of our GDP. And that's not the only concern that we have. One of the other most important ones is that oil, which has always been a vital military commodity, has now become much more of one. During the Gulf War, a contemporary U.S. Army heavy division, to illustrate, used more than twice as much oil on a daily basis as an entire World War II field army. Indeed, the 582,000 people we sent to the first Gulf War used more than twice as much oil every day as the entire 2 million-man Allied expeditionary force that liberated Europe in World War II. But as high as that use was, it's even higher now. There's been a 20% increase in the amount of oil for a deployed soldier that we now require. It now is 1 barrel of refined products per soldier per day, and it's going to go up further from there. Well, these costs have long been a concern to our organization. In fact, in 2003, we published a large study, America's Achilles Heel, The Hidden Cost of Imported Oil, that entailed the review of hundreds of thousands of pages of documents, including the entire order of battle of the U.S. Department of Defense. We looked at historic data. We just did a massive review, and we concluded at that point that the hidden cost of defense and other externalities came to $304.9 billion annually. That was equivalent at that time to adding $3.68 to the price of a gallon of gasoline. But much has changed since then. When we did that study, the refinery acquisition cost of a barrel of oil was $26.92. Indeed, in the base year, we spent $99 billion on oil imports and thought that was high. Well, In 2005, we spent $251,619,000,000 on oil imports. And this year, as the chairman noted, even if prices don't go above $60 a barrel, and I suspect they could, we're going to spend at least $320 billion on imported oil. But that's not all that's changed. In 2003, we were spending $49.1 billion annually to maintain the capability to defend the flow of oil from the Persian Gulf. And I should note, this is a commitment that is not new. We have had this commitment since February 14th, 1945, when Franklin Roosevelt met with King Abdulaziz of Saudi Arabia and basically came to an agreement we'd protect their oil in exchange for access to it. Every president, Republican and Democrat since then, has reaffirmed it. But now, when you add in the supplementals for Iraq, and I should say that it is foolish to suggest there's no connection to oil in our involvement there, the total comes to $132.7 billion annually. So what does this mean? Well, what it means is that the hidden cost in 2005 for our oil profligacy came to $779.5 billion. Now, we looked at two ways. We amortize it over the total volume of imports. Then we also look at the Persian Gulf separately because so much of the defense cost is loaded there. Well, if you look at it over the total volume of oil, it's like adding $4.10 to the price of a gallon of gasoline. In terms of the Persian Gulf, it's $7.41 to the price of a gallon of gasoline, which means at our current purchase price, you're talking not the true cost is $9.53 a gallon for 2005. But 2005 was just the beginning, because this year we're going to spend at least $320 billion on imports, as I said. That's a $70 billion increase in just 1 year. When we look at that, it raises the hidden cost to $825.1 billion. That's almost twice the President's request for the Department of Defense authorization for FY 2006. It also means that amortized over the total volume of oil, the premium in 2006 will be $5.04. Looking at the Gulf, $8.35. That means the real cost of a gallon of gasoline is about $10.86. To put it in perspective, if you drive a family sedan, a Toyota Camry, something like that, it's really costing you $217.20 to fill your tank. If you have a large SUV, like the Ford Expedition, you're spending $325.80 to fill your tank. Now, of course, the question is, can we do anything about it? Obviously, this is a drain on our economy we cannot afford, and yet we have had to sustain it. Well, the good news is the answer is yes, we can do something. The simple truth is our nation does not lack energy resources. What we have lacked is the political will and public commitment to make full use of what we have. In the short term, we face one critical problem. We've got a short-term problem and a long-term problem. In the short term, it's how do you fuel the 220 million privately owned vehicles that are on our roads today? They require some sort of fuel that will burn in a conventional internal combustion engine. In the out years, we need to look at how we can make that transition. So there's some things that we can do short-term. First, we need to take full advantage of our offshore oil in other places where we can get it, offshore in particular, because the access will be quicker. We need to expand our use of renewable fuels, alcohol and biodiesel. In that, I think we should really consider looking at opening up the Caribbean Basin as a source of those fuels, lifting the tariffs that we have on fuel alcohol for that region, and let those nations gain some economic traction. There's depressed sugar prices now. Turning that sugar into alcohol would help enhance our supplies, and there's plenty to go around. It's not going to compete with domestic producers. We can use everything they have and more. We also should look at non-petroleum consumption. The fact that two-thirds of our non-transportation consumption, the fact that two-thirds of our oil goes to transportation also means one-third doesn't. And in some ways, it's easier to fix that than it is to fix the auto fleet. For example, there's a fellow out in Moline, Illinois, a builder named George Bielecki, small guy. He's building homes that are 85% energy efficient, that use no oil whatsoever. They use geothermal heat pumps instead. And he's building for 20% less than conventional builders that don't have the features his homes do. There's a new process that's been developed in Canada. They are using it. This is not R&D. That turns wood into fuel oil that can be used. There are many things like that. But to do this, we have leadership. And in that regard, again, I want to note that Chairman Lugar and his colleagues, Senators Chafee, Coleman, Nelson, and Obama, deserve particular praise for their sponsorship of S2025, the Vehicle Choices for American Security Act. It's based on the energy security blueprint of the Set America Free Coalition, of which I have the honor of being one of the founding members. It's clear that this is the sort of bipartisan support for the issue that can help us avoid the Hobson's choice between economic catastrophe and global resource war. And one other point I really want to make sure we don't forget, some portion of every dollar we spend on imported oil finds its way into the hands of people who would do us harm. At least $1.5 billion of it does. So in essence, we're paying for both sides of the war on terrorism. We shouldn't have to, but the main thing to remember is the situation is not hopeless. We have the resources necessary to provide our nation's energy needs. All we have to do is find the political will to do so.
Well, thank you very much for that testimony. A great start for our morning, and we appreciate it. And I would just make the comment parenthetically as I interrupt the train of thought of witnesses that the President, in his speech yesterday at the Freedom House, in an extemporaneous response to a question on energy, gave a very passionate talk in which he touched upon each of the major themes that you, as witnesses, are going to be touching today, and indicated there are no end of technologies available in our country to deal with all of these, and a sense of urgency. And he admitted that some are skeptical about his speech in the State of the Union and the oil addiction remark. He acknowledges that, but he says, in fact, they're wrong, and that's where I am. So I appreciate that, and it gives me some encouragement in holding this hearing this morning with my colleagues, that we have, I think, a president now who is very much interested in this. And so we will make your statements available to the president so that he will have the benefit, as we have, of what you are having to say this morning. I'd like to call now upon Dr. Huntington.
Thank you, Chairman Lugar and Ranking Member Biden and distinguished members of the committee. I appreciate the opportunity to discuss with you today the hidden cost of oil. As you've mentioned, tight oil markets with minimal surplus capacity have made world oil prices jumpy. Over the last 6 months, a series of political and natural events have cascaded around the globe and left their impact on increasingly nervous oil-consuming nations. The list goes on. I have them in my handout, but basically suicide attack, thwarted suicide attack in Saudi Arabia, the Niger Delta speedboat attacks, the Venezuelan pipeline explosions, and of course the devastating hurricanes here in the United States. Each time they have a sporadic nature to them, and it conveys an element of unpredictability and surprise. I have recently coordinated several studies for the Energy Modeling Forum at Stanford University that relate directly to this issue. I'd like to share a few observations that I think summarize the perspectives of many, certainly not all, but many of the participants who were involved in these studies. Our forum frequently brings together leading experts and advisors from government, business, and universities and to discuss how we can improve analysis on key problems that keep policymakers awake at night. I think this is clearly one of them. In this particular case, the work was done primarily for the U.S. Department of Energy, But we were asked to invite those individuals we thought would be leading people on the issue. So I think it's a good cross-section of people working on the topic. Our two studies focused on two areas. One is the risk of another major oil disruption, and the second one is the economic consequences of those oil price shocks. I'm also submitting both reports that we did, and they certainly go in a lot more detail than I can remark here in my brief comments. I'll also just spend a little time talking about a third issue that we did not look at, but I have a few words to say on that, and that is our dependence on the oil-producing cartel. Although these recent episodes have made oil-importing countries nervous and have imposed some very high costs on people and infrastructure, they have yet really to duplicate the kinds of shocks that we experienced during the 1970s and the early 1980s, and the early 1990s, excuse me. As a result, their economic impacts have been more tolerable than in the past of these recent things. Despite recent oil price volatility, for example, we've still had very strong economic growth. GDP has maintained 3.5% since the end of 2001. A number of knowledgeable experts, however, are concerned about the very real possibility of more damaging shocks in the future. A group assembled by the Stanford's forum that I'm director of thought that the odds of at least one very damaging shock over the next 10 years were higher than a continuation of today's events, where we have kind of an oil market that has a lot of volatility, but without such a disruption. And although another major oil disruption is not a certainty, and I certainly don't want to be quoted as saying that I'm predicting it, its likelihood is significantly high that I think we have to be worried about it, and quite worried. Basically, the way I describe our results is that your odds of drawing a club, a diamond, or a heart from a shuffled deck of playing cards are 3 out of 4. In the EMF study that I referred to, the participants found that the odds of a foreign oil disruption is basically happening over the next 10 years is basically that. It was actually a little higher at 80%. And the disruption events that we looked at included surprise geopolitical, military, or terrorist turmoil that would remove at least 2 million barrels per day. That's about 2.1% of the expected global oil production. And in some cases it was more than that, but it had to at least remove that amount. Foreign disruptions of this magnitude would have more serious effects on oil prices and the economy than we have seen with Katrina and Rita. Oil prices, however, would rise more and longer for a few months, and longer than a few months and a heating season. And basically, we thought of these episodes as perhaps doubling the price in a 3-month period. In the study, the experts estimated the amount of oil lost to the market as the number of barrels removed from the market by the initial disruption, minus any offsets from using excess capacity from undisrupted regions. So if it wasn't in Saudi Arabia, maybe they might have some extra. If the disruption was not in Saudi Arabia, maybe they would have some extra capacity. We asked the experts to exclude any releases from the U.S. Strategic Petroleum Reserve, as these actions require separate decisions from the government during an emergency. The approach identified 4 major supply regions where disruptions are most likely, and you can imagine what those regions were. They account for roughly similar shares of total world oil production collectively, and as a group, they account for about 60% of total world oil production. And the study lumped in one region Algeria, Angola, Libya, Mexico, Nigeria, and Venezuela, and we called that the West of Suez. Saudi Arabia was the second region, and other Persian states, Iran, Iraq, Kuwait, and the other Persian Gulf states were the third region. And finally, Russia and the Caspian states comprised the fourth region. Of these regions, the riskiest areas were the Persian Gulf countries outside of Saudi Arabia, and as well as several countries along the Atlantic Basin, such as Nigeria and Venezuela. The least risky area from a disruption point of view, and a disruptional point of view only, was Russia and the Caspian states. Although the participants found the possibility of disruptions was lower in Saudi Arabia than in the other regions, certainly disruptions there would tend to have larger effects if they did happen. In the second study on the economic consequences of a major disruption, we sought to understand how easily the economy could absorb such a shock. And figure 1 that's shown here, as well as in my presentation, shows that oil price shocks preceded 9 out of the last 10 recessions in the United States. The solid line indicates the path of the inflation-adjusted crude oil prices since 1950. The line is kind of moving up and down around. The gray bars on the slide that are moving in a vertical direction denote periods when the U.S. economy was experiencing recessions, as defined by the National Bureau of Economic Research. This finding was first advanced by Professor James Hamilton at the University of California at San Diego, and it's been confirmed by a number of other researchers. So the price shocks occur before the recession, then the recession happens afterwards. If a large disruption does occur, we can expect very serious economic consequences. Large disruptions, especially if they move inflation-adjusted oil prices higher than experienced recently, will cause unemployment and excess capacity to grow in certain key sectors. Many large-scale models of the U.S. economy estimate that the level of real GDP could decline by 2% for a doubling of oil prices. That is the level of real GDP. And since the economy is growing more rapidly than 2% per year, that impact would not mean necessarily a recession, but it would certainly slow down economic growth. Other researchers in the group, however, think that these estimates underestimate the impacts because they do not focus explicitly on sudden and scary oil price shocks, which have a different character to the results. These other researchers think that our historical experience suggests that the level of real GDP would decline by more, and their estimate is at about 5% for a doubling of the oil price. My personal view is that this second estimate is probably closer to what would happen if the world actually had a major disruption, because I think they've taken the care to sort out shocks from other types of oil price movements. But if they are correct, it clearly means we're going to have a recession if we have a major disruption of this kind. Now, some people think that oil shocks may not be a problem because the Federal Reserve Board could intervene and lessen the impact. I have a great deal of faith in the Federal Reserve Board. They've done a marvelous job in controlling inflation, which places the U.S. economy in a better position for offsetting oil disruptions than in previous decades. However, I'm not an expert on the Federal Reserve Board, but I am not yet convinced that they can compensate the economy for a large, devastating disruption. They would have to make some important decisions very quickly at a time when fears were running rampant. They may also find it difficult to stimulate the economy because the nominal interest rates are already very low, both here in this country as well as abroad. For this reason, I think that the U.S. should seriously consider other types of insurance policies that would allow the Federal Reserve Board more leeway and flexibility in controlling our inflation rates. As a general rule, strategies that reduce our dependence on oil consumption are more effective than policies that reduce our imports. That may seem a little strange, but let me explain it this way. One should view the world oil market as one giant pool rather than as a series of disconnected puddles. So when events happen overseas, anywhere in the market, they will raise prices not only there, wherever the disruption is, but also everywhere that connect to that larger pool. And since reducing our imports with our own production does not sever this link to the giant pool, disruptions will cause prices to rise for all production, including that originating in the United States. So more domestic supplies by themselves do not really protect us from these price shocks. Reduction in our use tends to be more effective. Unfortunately, insurance policies are never free. I think we all recognize this. It will cost us something to implement a strategy that reduces our risk to a major oil disruption, but it will also cost us a lot of money and jobs if we do not adopt an insurance policy and the nation faces another major disruption. Now, figure 2 in my presentation, which I don't have shown separately, shows that the nation's oil use per dollar of gross domestic product can respond to oil prices. And as a result of the 1970 oil price shock, we shifted away from oil in many sectors in the early 1980s, as shown by the top line in that chart. But the trend has slowed considerably since then. Moreover, transportation remains strongly tied to oil use. The dependence, and the transportation line is shown on the bottom line in that chart. The dependence on oil in transportation not only affects households directly through higher gasoline costs, but it also raises the cost of transporting goods around the country. Now, our most recent studies did not address a third issue that could influence the cost of using oil, and let me say a word about it. And that is that the United States could adopt policies that would try to minimize or break the oil-producing cartels' control over the market. Our forum many years ago addressed this issue, and although the range of views was wide, the working group then conservatively estimated that the hidden cost of oil from this source might be something on the order of 12 cents per gallon, or if you're used to thinking of it in dollars, thinking in terms of per barrel, it's $5 per barrel or 12 cents per gallon. That was the estimate. In their view of in the review of the corporate average fuel efficiency standards of several years ago, the National Research Council used a very similar estimate. That estimate is not trivial, but it is certainly not as large as some of the estimates I've seen for gasoline's hidden costs due to pollution, congestion, and automobile accidents. So as I move, to try to summarize, I think the nation is vulnerable to another major disruption, not because the economy necessarily imports oil, but because it uses a lot of oil, primarily for gasoline and jet fuel. Even if domestic production could replace all our imports, which I'm not advocating that we do that, the economy would remain vulnerable to the types of disruptions discussed here. However, it is very appropriate for the committee to focus on oil because I think it is essentially a foreign issue. Oil importing governments have committed significant political and military resources to the Middle East over a number of decades in order to provide regional stability for the world oil supplies. Excessive exposure to our oil vulnerability risks in this country increases the cost of pursuing foreign policy. It's much, as you called, it's often used as a weapon against the oil-weak countries, I think, Senator Lugar, is the way you put it very elegantly. And I think that's a very key concern, and it reduces our capacity to conduct the foreign policy in this way. Unfortunately, none of the estimates that I've seen can really put a number on that figure, and yet it may be the most important issue of all as we talk about this issue. And it's encouraged me to think more about this issue. Maybe we can try to develop something along that line. So in sum, I would say it's a very important foreign issue. And I think that it's only right that you are concerned about it, and I'm extremely pleased that you are concerned about it. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Dr. Hunting, for your contribution to this discussion this morning. We call now on Dr. Yo.
Mr. Chairman, members of the committee, thank you very much for your invitation to present testimony today on the hidden costs of oil. My task is to think about the hidden costs related to climate change that is buried in the background of petroleum costs that don't reflect that externality. And the idea is to try to back out the share of oil to get the right order of magnitude in thinking about such things. I'm afraid that the answer to this deceptively simple question is the same as it is to just about every economics question that I've ever seen, and that is that it depends. And so what I would like to do is spend a little bit of time walking you through some of the context of what it depends on and how much Mother Nature and scientific uncertainty plays a role in that. I will begin with a brief review of 100 published estimates of what is termed the social cost of carbon, which can be backed down to the social cost of the carbon content of petroleum. I will observe that those estimates vary all over the map and offer some explanation of why. I will also try to provide an alternative way about thinking about the hidden cost of oil, and that is the notion that the climate is changing, may in fact turn out to be changing abruptly. There will be times perhaps in the future when we begin to recognize that, and sudden adjustments in climate policy will be required. The cost of those adjustments will be much smaller if we begin to hedge against those costs, and that gets us out of the realm of thinking about the uncertainty of climate damages and into the realm, which is still uncertain but not quite as uncertain, the realm of estimating the economic cost of energy policy per se. It also allows uncertainty to become a reason to do something in the near term rather than a reason to delay, because this hedging strategy is essentially, as Hill just mentioned in another context, buying insurance. And the more risk you face and the wider the uncertainties, the more insurance you pay, the more insurance you buy at a particular premium, but uncertainty is the reason why you're doing something. I will finally argue that perhaps another hidden cost is embedded in the investment decisions that are made in the public arena and in the private arena, that ignoring the social costs, climate costs of petroleum systematically undervalues investment projects that would provide alternative fuels like ethanol. I've heard that mentioned 2 or 3 times this morning already. And perhaps more of concern, it overvalues investments in projects that would actually perhaps increase our reliance and consumption of petroleum. So, to wander through these thoughts, economists may disagree on the number, but they do agree on the approach to thinking about the hidden cost, the climate change cost of carbon, and that is to think about the marginal cost of a unit of emissions at a particular point in time as it's cast forward. And you try to track where the damages occur and try to estimate those damages and bring it back to get some idea of what is the extra social damage created by those particular units of emission. Economists also, oddly enough, agree on something else, that is that this social cost estimate will rise over time at 2 to 3% per year as concentrations of greenhouse gases increase. Where they don't agree is, of course, on the estimation per se. So what I would like to do is provide a couple of glimpses of the sources of concern from the climate literature. On your right is a figure from the third assessment report of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. It is a summary of the lines of evidence of impacts of climate, and identified are 5 different reasons for concern. The color codes suggest the degree of vulnerability that systems around the world might face, even taking into account to as much degree as possible the ability of those systems to adapt to those external stresses. It goes from white, which is not much vulnerability, through yellow and orange and up to red. In the red areas, it's essentially a judgment by the people who assess the literature that the capacity to adapt to these climate-related stresses may in fact be overwhelmed by the stresses that are there. It's also important to notice that any one of those lines of concern, sources of vulnerability, are unevenly distributed around the globe. So the second figure that I provided indicates 2 different possibilities for a picture in 2050. One calibrates vulnerability around the world to aggregate impacts, which is the second row on that particular, on the burning embers diagram from the IPCC. It suggests that developing countries are, as according to the hypothesis, perhaps more vulnerable to climate change, but the developed world doesn't go away scot-free either. If you calibrate the distribution in terms of something a little bit more urgent, like the risk of extreme weather events, The portrait for 2050 again displays high vulnerabilities now in the developing world and significant vulnerability across the developed world, including North America, which sits up there in an orange, and if you look over there, it's sort of on its way to being something to which we could begin to worry that even our ability to respond to the external stresses of these climate events might be overwhelmed by the events themselves. So economists have then taken a look at these and tried to estimate them over time. I didn't ask that the third figure I provided be blown up, but there is a distribution indicated there of the estimates of the social cost of carbon across the 100 published estimates that are currently available, expressed both in dollars per ton of carbon emitted and also backed into dollars per barrel based on the carbon content of petroleum. Now, the way to read the table, at least in terms of the numbers, is to think about your old days when you took SATs and think about percentiles. Point A, for example, indicates the estimate of 0 for the social cost of carbon. It's the 14th percentile, indicating that 14% of these estimates actually had negative costs, i.e. benefits. How's that possible? Some of the estimates, some of the models suggest some moderate benefit to some sectors of developed economies for very modest changes in climate, and a high discount rate that picks up very little of the downstream costs could end up with a benefit to climate. But the median estimate is point B. That's where 50% of the estimates are below that number and 50% are above that number. That comes out to about $2 a barrel. The 80th percentile is $9 a barrel. That means 80% are below that, but 20% of the estimates are above $9 a barrel. And the average across all of the estimates, because the distribution is skewed, is $11 a barrel. And to reemphasize, the notion is that those are for emissions in 2005, and that they would increase, those costs would increase at 2 or 3% per year. So how do you interpret the content of that? Richard Toll, a friend of mine who's an economist at the University of Hamburg, looks at that distribution. He's actually the one who did the meta-analysis that produced it, and said that it looks like $50 a barrel is about the maximum reasonable number for the social cost of carbon. Tom Downing, who's a geographer at the Stockholm Environment Institute, however, looks at that distribution, and he's one that spent a lot of time looking at vulnerabilities across Africa and developing countries, looking at the risks that peoples in those places face to changes in climate, and he thinks $50 is a threshold as well, but he thinks it's the lower bound. He thinks the social cost of carbon is legitimately much above $50 a barrel. How do we get such a wide range? Well, there are a lot of different reasons. I already mentioned the discount rate. There's also the possibility of equity weighting. Do you really worry about the people in Africa versus the people in a developed world? These are choices that decision makers get to make, parameters they get to think about as they judge the opportunity cost and the degree to which they would like to pursue policies in terms of these particular problems. There are, however, a wide number of parameters underneath those estimates over which you do not have decision-maker authority. These are essentially determined by Mother Nature. The major one is climate sensitivity, the degree to which the global mean temperature would increase if atmospheric concentrations were to double. The IPCC has reported that number between 1.5 degrees and 4.5 or 5.5 degrees, depending on which report you read, but more recent research suggests that the historical data cannot reject the hypothesis that climate sensitivity could be as high as 8 or 9 or 10 degrees centigrade. And if you plug those climate sensitivities into a model, even if you have high discount rates and don't worry about equity at all, you still get a high social cost of carbon. So decision makers cannot get out of it with respect to that. So the question, I think, is, given the range of uncertainty and given the attempts to understand where it comes from, and recognizing that we simply don't know what Mother Nature has in store for us, how do we think about the social cost of carbon in a constructive way? And I would like to propose a second way, which, as I suggested earlier, was to think about hedging against the adjustment costs of making policy decisions in the near to medium term that would essentially have to abruptly change the way we consume energy. What might such a thing be? Abrupt climate change, it's called risks of large-scale discontinuities in the jargon of the IPCC, is one place. Some work that I've done with Michael Schlesinger and some other folks suggests, for example, that if the global mean temperature were to increase another 2 degrees from 2000 levels, that there would be a 50% chance of the collapse of the thermohaline circulation, otherwise known as the Gulf Stream. You were talking about pulling cards out of a deck. That's a flip of a coin. Head, it shuts down. Tails, it keeps going. We're not quite sure exactly how that's going to happen, but that's the best that our scientific knowledge will tell us. And should it become clear that that's happening and that's not an experiment we'd like to try on the only planet we have, there might come a time when we need to make a policy adjustment. So my proposal is to think about minimizing the expected costs of making such policy adjustments. And again, Michael Schlesinger and I and a couple of other people did a little thought exercise in a very simple model that was actually motivated by an exercise that the Energy Modeling Forum put together 15 years ago, and came up with the notion that about $1.50 a barrel starting now as the reflection of a climate policy, but increasing persistently and predictably at the rate of interest over time, would be a reasonable hedge against the abrupt economic costs of abrupt changes in policy. It's a very simple exercise. It only had one source of uncertainty, the climate sensitivity, so I think that number is too low, but it's indicative of the notion that you can think about that as an insurance premium, as a hedge against something that we can predict and estimate a little bit more than climate effects. And it does, as I said before as well, give uncertainty the reason to do something rather than the reason not to do something. Lastly, the last hidden cost that I mentioned, it strikes me that if you do not include the environmental costs of petroleum, the climate costs of petroleum, in your evaluations of what it really costs the planet for you to burn a barrel of oil for whatever purpose, you systematically undervalue conservation projects, programs, plans, policies. Projects that would look for alternative energy sources, things that are more sustainable. And that is, and makes it less likely that those projects would be undertaken. Systematically as well, you overvalue new sources of oil, you overvalue new sources of consumption of oil, simply because the energy required to drive it is not priced appropriately. So, if you ask me what a number would be, as I said, I think $1.50 is too low. I think $6 would be okay. That's the Downing toll threshold. $10 might be okay. It's actually really less important what number starts the policy now. It is more important and absolutely critical that it increase over time at a predictable rate, like the rate of interest, which has some economic validation to it. It then becomes predictable, it's persistent, and it's incorporated in the planning and investment decisions that people would undertake. I would encourage the second risk approach to thinking about climate policy, get out of the cost-benefit calculator mode and begin to think about managing risks and thinking about policy portfolios. And uncertainty becomes the reason to do something in the near term and to continue to do something at an increasing rate over the medium term. I thank you very much for your attention.
Well, thank you very much, Dr. Yeo, for once again a very informative and provocative discussion. I want to call upon Distinguished Ranking Member Senator Biden for an opening statement or opening comments that he might have for the hearing.
I'd just like to explain to this impressive panel that the reason I was there, we have what we call in the jargon a markup in the Judiciary Committee, which I happen to be a member of as well, and I apologize for being late. I look forward to reading all your statements, and when it's appropriate, I have a few questions, but in the meantime, I put my statement in the record rather than take the time now.
Thank you. The statement will be placed in the record in full. Let me begin the questioning. We'll have a 10-minute round and perhaps several rounds because there is so much to talk about. Let me begin with some topical references to what we're talking about today that I culled from the New York Times this morning. Three perspectives. One, it deals with the problems in Ukraine following the election, but really going back to January 1st, when Russia cut off some gas lines and delivery to Ukraine. Ukraine citizens then took some gas from lines that were going across Ukraine to Europe. 48-hour contre-attempts occurred, and the article describes the very unusual organization that was formed by Russia. It starts with a rather bizarre thought that the head of this organization is in a remote house and no one has ever heard of him and this sort of thing. The problem, however, is acute for the citizens of Ukraine, even as they try to form their government. In large part because the gas was shut off, it is apparent that President Yushchenko lost a great deal of authority. He lost it in two ways, one of which was that his country was cold. People were cold physically. The industry, which was fledgling, was stymied. I've described this, I hope in not ultra-dramatic ways, as waging war without sending the first troops across the line, or bombing, or strafing. You can ruin, decimate a country by cutting off energy, and that was the intent. Now, nevertheless, the world came to the rescue. Europeans said to President Putin, you're the head of G8, you want to talk about energy this year, don't do this to all of us, meaning Germans, Poles, others. We've had the president of Poland here testifying what it's like when the pressure goes down in your country, because it's coming across Ukraine and it's being stolen there. In essence, this is for real. This is not hypothetical anymore with regard to fairly large nation states. However, the article points out that we're 90 days into the 6 months of the deal. It only lasts for 6 months. Some Turkmenistan gas mixed together with some Russian gas with a very strange entity somewhere based in Switzerland, rather difficult for anyone to find. For President Yushchenko, for Ms. Tymoshenko, former prime minister, leader of the party that came in second, or for the former prime minister whose party came in first. And the people of Ukraine tried to weigh, how do you do this at this point? You have a government that might be more sympathetic to Russia, and therefore perhaps the next deal, July 1st, works out differently. Or do you go with Ms. Tymoshenko, for example, who says down with the Russians, independence, investigation into all of this, and so forth. So the implications we're going to see played out in the next few days, and April the 7th being the first day in which a government might be formed, will be interesting on some of the relevant problems here. At the end of the day, however, the pricing for Ukraine was $95 for the units of gas that used to cost $55. The Russians had demanded $220. They gave Belarus $47 the same day. And then when people talking about market forces here are up against the fact that we're talking about nationalized industries that use power plays for their advantage. Now, I mention that because this comes in the same paper in which the headline, automakers use new technology to beef up muscle, not mileage. And I hope I don't over-summarize by pointing out that essentially, and the article points out as to why this is the emphasis, it says in improving fuel economy, virtually everyone agrees that there is only one way to do it. There has to be a will. There's no shortage of technology, said a senior analyst of environmental defense. However, the fact is that the automobile companies have decided that most saleable product is more zoom in the cars. If you want to at least have something that is marketable, a car that gets off the mark faster rather than slower is more desirable. Some would even emphasize, after all, a large car is safer. A huge tank running down the street is probably more defensible than a small car. So all things considered, the technology may be there, but the market strategy is really to sell something else, which is somewhat discouraging, given our parley this morning. Finally, there is a very interesting profile of the new president or chief executive of ExxonMobil. It is flattering in some respects that he has indicated, for example, and I quote, he defends Exxon's record of investing to search for alternative fuels, saying that a $100 million contribution to the Global Climate Energy Project at Stanford University, focused on long-term technological changes. However, he said, we are looking for fundamental changes, but that is decades away. The question is, what are we going to do in the meanwhile? Now, his suggestion is explore for oil and gas. And it commends finds in Indonesia, for example, which have been significant recently. But then it also points out in the article that it's hard even for ExxonMobil, with all of its resources, to find enough gas or oil day by day to replenish that which is all being produced. In other words, the precarious political position in Qatar, which is another find recently, is a very different one than even 2, 3, 5 years ago for this very large company. However, the article points out, getting back to what people would say is reality, is that ExxonMobil, in terms of its per share earnings, has been doing better than BP and Chevron, sometimes cited by environmentalists and others as being more with it and taking a look at the issues we're discussing today. In short, the Wall Street people, as the article points out, look at earnings per share and give appropriate rewards for this situation. Maybe the same way a motorist trying to get off to a fast start after a stoplight looks at the engineering that may give that kind of a boost. So here we are discussing today a subject in which topically there are crises in the world that are observed by some, although as I give a speech about Ukraine in my visits last September with President Yushchenko and Ms. Tymoshenko and their apprehensions about all of this, they find much of this to be news, that actually there was a cutoff, that these things happen in the world. In other words, the transmission from people who are having academic discussions or even Foreign Relations Committee meetings about this to the grassroots still have a long way to go. And this is why in the President's statement, we're addicted to oil and we have to transfer 50 or 75% of our needs somewhere else in a while is important because it catches the attention of tens of millions of people all at once, whereas we capture very few. I would just ask this, however. You've, in your papers, given some remarkable estimates of the costs involved in this. For instance, Dr. Yo, you've suggested that even without knowing in the climate change situation what any of these catastrophes may mean, what I gathered was that we should be setting aside $1.50 a gallon as, I guess, an endowment fund or some type of emergency fund for the catastrophes to come. In other words, recognizing that the probability of catastrophe is very high or high enough to merit this kind of public policy change. Is that right? Essentially, just physically in our budget policy, what should we do? Have an account, let's say for energy or climate change catastrophe or however we want to characterize this, and put that aside in the same way we would do, say, the Social Security Reserve Fund or something else that has a dedicated public notice.
My thought wasn't exactly that. I don't want to be flip, but I hesitate to tell members of Congress this is money you can do with what you want. It is essentially sending a price signal that the economic costs on the environment need to be incorporated in the cost of petroleum. How you do that, whether or not you tax petroleum at $1.50 a barrel or $10 a barrel, or you set up carbon permits so that the targeted price is that. The critical notion is that that rent that's reflected in the price increase at a rate of interest. And were it taxed and the revenue collected, then it would make sense, it seems to me, to think about what to do with that money, to encourage alternative sources of energy. There are adaptation funds being set up by the GEF under the Framework Convention on Climate Change that begin to try to help developing countries participate. One of the concerns in the Energy Committee is that we need broad global participation in a climate policy. Perhaps you could offer them climate insurance or climate variability insurance if they were willing to sign on to some mitigation, some best practices in terms of their energy investment.
The reason I raise it in this way is, for instance, Mr. Koplos has raised the point that we will be spending $320 billion or so, as I suggested, at the $60 level, and we already know, at least as of today, the price has gone to 65, and who knows where from there. That's an amount of money that our country is spending somewhere else. The implications for our federal budget that you have mentioned, Mr. Koplos, in terms of the defense budget, go way up to $132 billion or some such amount. This we have to pay. We're appropriating money for defense, and of that money, $132 billion is involved in the expense of this oil. Now, that's why it seems to me that if we're to get serious about this sort of thing, we could, as you say, simply put a tax on $1.50 or $6, whatever you suggested. It translates into so much per gallon, but that revenue would flow in to our treasury. It would help pay for either part of the $300 billion trade deficit or the $129 billion of domestic deficit, but really be lost in the shuffle without any recognition that we think there's a problem here, that probably, even if we don't know which of these disasters are going to occur, is going to cost us some money. For example, we quickly cobbled together some money to help when the terrible storm came to Indonesia, because it's an emergency. People are dying. There's all sorts of difficulties there. Now, it may not have been climate change. Some would say the recurrence of some of these storms has some traces here, but it certainly would be a climate change if Bangladesh went underwater, at least 10 million people. And what do we do then? Well, we quickly appropriate an emergency appropriation from nothing. We just simply add to the deficit. That's why I just wanted, for the sake of argument with this expert panel, to think if we're serious about this, whether we try to identify, literally, an insurance policy, as you've suggested. And maybe we change the actuarial principles as time goes on in the same way that you do, from yellow to red. If it's getting more red, maybe the thing goes up. But at least at that point, there is some recognition in a public policy way. For the moment, there is not. Essentially, without describing to ExxonMobil their views on this, they are not unique in saying that, of course, there must be a problem out there. Clearly, something is happening. But we really don't know. The science is still not necessarily vague, but in dispute. And therefore, to change policies while this great public dispute is going on among academics and a few politicians would not be very sound in benefiting our stockholders or any prudent person in business. So we're back to that again. Essentially, while we're talking here about what we think is going to be a catastrophe. Now, eventually, if any of you gentlemen are right, the catastrophe comes, somebody will say, why was there no vision? Why was there no courage? Why didn't somebody rise up? You know, this is the attempt to do that, to have hearings like this in which these questions are raised, and hopefully people who are expert like you inform us who are not so expert, but who are learners, and are trying very hard to see what sort of public policy ought to be adopted, or at least advocated by some of us, understanding that you have to be patient sometimes for some of these things to get through two houses and be signed. With all of that, let me turn to my colleague.
I agree. Gentlemen, there used to be a song that was popular back in the late 50s when I was in high school. And I forget who sang it, but the lyrics were, I remember the lyrics went, tick-a-tick-a-tock, timing is the thing. Timing is everything. And it seems to me, and I have been of the view, that there is an environmental catastrophe in the making, and I've been of the view that that's been the case for the last decade. And I don't know nearly as much as all of you know, or any one of you know, but it seems to me we may, and that famous that phrase has become, title of a book's become a phrase that everybody's beginning to digest. We're maybe heading toward a tipping point here. But I don't get the sense that that has been in any way absorbed by the public. Those of us who think, the chairman being one, who think that we have got to deal for a whole range of reasons with our energy policy, environmentally, from a foreign policy standpoint, from the standpoint of, in effect, developing entire new industries, if you look at it optimistically. The idea of an environmental tax is you first have to convince people there's an environmental disaster in the making, or that they can somehow quantify for average people, and the American people are pretty darn smart, to see the correlation between a $10 a barrel tax, or whatever the number is, and their ability to breathe clean air, or not have their roses grow in December in New York State. So when you guys talk about this, it's not your responsibility, I acknowledge, to do this. From a public policy standpoint and the saleability of this, I mean, what kind of feedback do you all get when you make this case to, and I know you're usually making the cases you're making here to public policy panels and or to other academics. But I mean, when you have this conversation at the barbecue in the backyard with your next door neighbor who works for the electric company, or is is a salesman for whatever, I mean, how do you talk to them about it? Or do you?
Perhaps I could give you some indication, because I had a recent experience that really brought that home to me. I have an article in the current issue of the American Legion magazine dealing with this and possible solutions. And I've had probably 200, it only came out last week, 200 emails from members of the Legion around the country who'd read the article and responded. And uniformly, they have expressed concern. They kind of understand it, but the problem is they don't know what to do about it, and that's why they're asking. That plus some rhetoric about brain-dead people in Washington not addressing the issue, that
resonates in my community.
Yeah, and but it's not that people don't get it. It's that they want it. Americans are doers. They don't, they don't want you to overwhelm them with some sort of rhetoric or preach catastrophe. They know there's a problem. They're not stupid. what they say is, okay, now what are you going to do about it? We're practical people. I earlier had mentioned a good example of this, which I think shows the sort of thing we have to start encouraging. There's a fellow out in Moline, Illinois, where Senator Obama just opened an office, actually. Had never built a doghouse in his life, no background in construction, was providing visiting nurses to retirement communities, and said, you know, these people are really being taken. These people are getting shafted. This is terrible. They worry about locking their door. I could put my hand through the wall. It's so flimsy. We can do better. So he went out and he looked up all sorts of environmental technologies, and he built his first development 2 years ago. Homes that anyone would be proud to live in, and he built them for $130 a square foot, which is 20% less than the average in his area, and they're 80 to 85% energy efficient. The word got out on this little thing. In fact, in January and February of 2005, when they had a very cold winter, the average utility bill for an entire unit, 2,000 square foot unit, was $98. He's got some new units he's built. They're 1,750 square feet, and during that recent cold snap they had in Moline, the heating bill for an average 750 square foot home was $25. In fact, he was laughing that they had to pay more in community fees and taxes and hookup fees than they were for the actual energy to heat their homes. This uses no new technology. It's not, and this is a guy who's not an engineer or scientist. He said, I'm going to go out and do something about it. And that ultimately is what we've got to start encouraging people to do. If we point them in a direction, if we say, look, you can do X, Y, and Z, and it makes real good sense because the American people are sensible. You say, yeah, this makes common sense, just do these things and you can save yourself. Geothermal heat pumps, for example, from the day one of installation in every heating zone in this country, you save money if you use a geothermal heat pump.
Okay, now what would that same guy say? Say, by the way, Charlie, I've just convinced the Congress to raise the price of a gallon of gasoline at the pump for you 35 cents or $1. So you're going to say, great, that's right up my alley, man.
He's going to say, who's that guy? I'm going to vote against him.
That's right.
And the other thing we have to bear in mind about that is, we talk about high prices for gasoline, and I'm sure you senators realize you travel outside the U.S., we don't pay high prices for gasoline. As a practical rule, because we are a very wealthy nation with a high median income, you would have to raise the price of gasoline so high to have an effect on consumption that it's impractical. I mean, say $3 a gallon of gasoline, fine. The average person uses 1,000 gallons a year. The median income in this country is $44,000 and change, almost 45. You're talking 6% of gross income. And also against the background that 90% of all driving is non-discretionary. You have to go to work, you have to go to the grocery store, you have to take kids to school. So you're only playing with about 10% there one way or the other. Price increases per se are not going to change patterns of driving.
So the only reason for the price increase then, justified, would be for this, in effect, insurance policy.
Yeah,
All right.
let me respond to a couple of things I've just heard. First of all, I don't agree as an economist that a price signal won't work. Now, I admit that it won't work in anything that would be politically viable over the near term, but remember I was talking about a price that was persistently increasing, predictably increasing over time, so that investment decisions that private individuals make on automobiles, that industry makes on their plant and equipment, that government makes on their infrastructures, knows that the tax was 10 cents in 2005, but it's going to be 20 cents in 2020 and 35 cents in 2025, and you build that into.
But do you think that affects behavior of consumer, the average consumer? I mean, I don't know any consumer where I live who thinks that their gasoline prices are ever going to go back down again. I don't know anybody. Who thinks, Joe, we're going to get back down to 95, 85 cents a gallon. I don't know anybody who thinks we're going to get down to $1 a gallon. And everybody that I know, and I'm just a plain old politician now, not an economist, and I think I probably am better at this than you are, guessing what average people think they're going to do. I'm presumptuous of me to say that, but I think most everybody here is. That's our living. And the fact is, I think everybody thinks the price is going to continue to go up. I don't know anybody who thinks that 10 years from now, they're not going to be paying more for a gallon of gasoline than they are today. A year from now, they're not going to be paying more. And it may go from $3 down to $2.56 or $2.36 and back up to $2.80, but it's going to go from $2.36 to $3, and next year it's going to go from $2.42 to $3.2. Next year it's going to go from $2.75. I mean, so I don't get your point that if you said to the consumer, now, in long-term investment by maybe a guy building a new warehouse and storage facility, I don't disagree with you. I think that will affect that kind of behavior, but the significant portion of the consumption is coming from non-discretionary fuel costs that go into people driving automobiles, I think. And so I'm always attracted, but I think to take a name where that's become very popularly associated with the gas tax, Tom Friedman. I have great respect for Friedman. I think he has been pretty prescient about a number of the things he has written about over the last 10, 12 years. But on the gasoline tax, I kind of come out where you do, sir. I mean, I don't see any change in behavior or consumption when gasoline went to $3 a gallon. Did it? I mean, is there anything that did people, even though it was temporary, but did anybody? I didn't notice much.
Senator, there's a waiting list. I'm on it for Dodge Charger RTS8.
Yeah.
It's got a 454 horsepower Hammer.
Yeah.
Well, little turn 13s, That's, people are not concerned. The only times that you saw a change in the purchasing of automobiles related to mileage, when people really started basing their decisions, there were only two occasions, 1973 and 1979. They both were specifically tied to an absence of energy. We had gasoline lines and people were shooting each other. And that gets down to a very fundamental point that we have to understand, and that is that it is the availability of energy that drives behavior, not the price. Whatever the price of energy is, we will adjust sooner or later. The only times price is there is one time it can be a factor, and that's if it's a shocking price. In Maryland, in several other states, we see electricity prices predicted to go up 72% this summer. Consumers are up in arms because they see this as a huge spike. But I'll tell you what, 6 months after it's in effect, people will have adjusted and they won't have changed their behavior.
Well, I hope that's wrong, but I'm afraid I worry you may be right, which leads me to, look, I'm asking deliberately and intentionally asking topical questions here about how, because I don't disagree with what you're asserting as to the extent of the problem, the need to deal with the problem, and the fact that there are those boneheads here in Washington aren't paying attention to this, and we're going to all say 2, 5, 10, 12 years from now, my God, why didn't anybody talk about this? So we're all on the same page in that regard. But one of the things that seems to sell with average people as it relates to the notion of whether or not their behavior will be affected by anything is that, and I mean behavior affected by, should we be spending more federal tax dollars investing in alternative energy sources? Should we be doing it through incentives? Should we be doing it direct loans? Should we be doing it by generating it ourselves, et cetera? Whose statement it was, excuse me, Mr. Huntington's statement. You said, as a general rule, strategies that reduce our dependence on oil consumption are more effective than policies that reduce our imports. We should view oil markets as one giant pool rather than a series of disconnected puddles. When events happen anywhere in the market, they will raise prices not only there but also everywhere that connect to that large pool. more domestic supplies will not protect us from these price shocks. The oil companies have this nice, and others have this nice mantra that the way in which to drive down prices, the way in which to stabilize prices, is we got to go out and find more oil. And that the impression is, particularly if we found domestic oil. If we find more domestic oil, then we're going to be not home free, but we're going to have a lot more control. So really, we should be investing our resources, them as well as the federal government. For example, we passed an energy bill at the time when the oil companies are having, and I'm not making the populist argument, but just a factual argument, when they're having these gigantic surpluses in terms of profit, and we decided we needed to give them, what was it, $6 billion? $2.5 billion. A $2.5 billion incentive for them to go out and look for more oil. And people here, they drank the Kool-Aid. They said, yeah, it sounds right, because we got to get more domestic oil. Talk to me a moment about, all three of you, if you would, about what benefit, let's assume we were able to discover and produce 3 times the amount of oil we are now producing domestically. And we found it overnight. That could come online over the next 4 years. We found it in the middle of Delaware, or in Maine, in Washington State. I mean, we found it unlikely places. Boom, all of a sudden we tripled with essentially the same recovery cost. What would be the effect of that?
Well, maybe I should jump in here, since
Please.
that was the comment that you took from me. I think it's very important to emphasize that the oil market can be in a couple of different kind of situations. The kind of situation I was talking about was when there's a disruption on the market. My point there was that the price is going to rise for everything, and just by having more domestic supplies is not going to protect you from that price rise. But now let's take the other state of the world where you actually, the state of the world where we live in most of the time when we don't have a disruption. A more domestic supplies is going to help pull down the price of oil on the market. Just by putting that more supply on, we will help the market out that way. So the price will be lower, and so that would actually be beneficial. If it was economic, it would be beneficial. The problem would come in is if it was not economic, then that would be you're really kind of hiding the cost in a way. You're saying, yes, I'm putting on more supply, but it's really costing the taxpayers a whole lot more money somehow because we're giving it subsidies, so it comes on.
If I can add on to that, if we would have to find a heck of a lot more than twice or 3 times what we're producing now, wouldn't we, to meet our domestic energy needs? What would we have to do to meet our domestic energy needs in terms of being, quote, totally self-sufficient as it relates to oil and gas?
We'd have to roughly triple what we use about 20.8 million barrels a day, and we import 12 and change that. So it's about 2/3 of what we use as imports. So we'd have to roughly have 3 times our production. But I think one point we have to look at here in terms of the argument over domestic oil, foreign oil, kind of in one way misses the point, because we're going to run out of oil. That's a given. If you take a look at global demand, I don't care how much we produce in year. The Chinese are adding 120 million cars. You look at demand, and just third world demand alone in 2025 is going to require an additional 30 million barrels a day. When you add in the rest of us, it's 40. And there's no there. It can't be done. What we need to do is facilitate the transition away from a reliance on oil as a motor fuel in other areas. But to do that, we have another problem. There are 220 million privately owned vehicles on the road today. They have an average age of 8.5 years, an average lifespan of 16.8. Actually, it's a little longer than that in reality. So basically, for a decade, because people are not going to junk their cars, you're going to have to do something to provide them with fuel. That means you need something that can burn in those cars. Now, fortunately, we have some options. We've got alcohol, we've got biodiesel, which can help to a degree. If we can find a little more natural gas, we can actually turn some of that into a motor fuel if we have to. But in the near term, I'm talking about 5, 10 years, as we make the initial start of the transition, we really need to use you need to use oil and gas. To the extent we can do it domestically, we're actually better off. In the longer term, what we need to do is understand that that's a temporary fix that keeps us from having an economic calamity, and then we start bringing in all the alternatives.
Excuse me, that both of these conversations are missing one of the fundamental points that I teach my students, that there are two sides to every market. I think the simple answer to your question, what happens if we tripled our supplies, given in the context of what Hill put in his statement, is that we could join OPEC, that we would become a supplier of petroleum to the world, and that would be something that would allow us to participate with respect to that. The other thing is going back to the price size business and the changes in behavior. Senator Lugar was speaking about more Zoom in the car. A story that I can remember from a National Academy panel meeting 2.5 years ago, where somebody fairly high up, and I don't know his name, so that's probably good, from Ford Motor Company said that they could not see any way that hybrid automobiles would become popular in the United States, and that Ford had no intention of creating them or marketing them.
I had a similar conversation with Chrysler.
And if you look lately, they are. And why? It's because the demand side of the market has responded. So that the part of the political leadership that is required is to alert people of these problems and get them to understand that it's changes in their behavior at a pace where it is not uneconomic to do it. Will help the problem a good deal. You don't have to junk your 4-year-old car, but next time it's time to buy a car, go look at a Prius until Ford gets one that looks the same and works just as well.
Well, my time is way over. I appreciate it, Mr. Chairman. I would like to submit several questions in writing. There's so many more things I'd like to ask each of you. Let me conclude, Mr. Chairman, by recounting a similar example. 1974, I was a young senator in the garret in this office building, number 100 in Seniority, and I got a call from a fellow named Mr. Ricardo, chairman of the board of the Chrysler Corporation, and Leonard Woodcock, the president of the UAW, and asked if they'd come to see me. And they sat in my office and jointly told me that I could not support, I had run as a bit of an environmentalist, I could not support the Clean Air Act, because the Clean Air Act was going to put restrictions some way on tailpipe emissions of automobiles. I'll never forget Mr. Ricardo looking at me, Mr. 74, and saying, "Don't understand," and I think I'm right about the numbers. We now have 18% of the large car market. It is our plan in the next 5 years to get 35% of the large car market. So much for management vision about how they were going to move. Anyway, I thank you all very much. Thank you for your indulgence, Mr. Chairman, and I'd like to submit some questions in writing.
The questions will be submitted for the record, and hopefully, if you will do so, answer the ranking member's questions, because they will be an important part of fulfilling our record and our understanding. Let me just pick up a little bit on the conversation that you've had with Senator Biden, and further my interest in what is being offered to American motorists in this particular year. The New York Times story that I mentioned, just to make the point, says that the 1975 Pontiac Firebird could get from 0 to 60 miles per hour in 9.8 seconds. The 2005 Toyota Camry can make it in 8.1. Now, the point they're trying to make is that the developments in the last 30 years have been largely in terms of performance and the zoom speed, as I described it. But in this particular year, if we are hoping and holding our breath that that is not where the technology is being focused, the point is that the 2006 Cadillac STS-V can reach 60 miles per hour in 5 seconds. And that unfortunately appears to be where the competition is. In the process of this, and I quote the President in his speech yesterday, he talked about the technologies that are out there. And they are. I saw the distinguished president of Purdue University yesterday, Martin Jischke, and he's very enthusiastic at that university about taking on all of these technologies in a comprehensive way. But so have automobile companies, in fairness, some very talented people. Now, the dilemma here is described further in the New York Times story by someone who noted that he would like to get better gas mileage, but he's been driving, in essence, the truck for years. He's comfortable in a truck. He doesn't want a Prius. He wants a truck. And therefore, even though it does cost more, and he acknowledges $3 a gallon is more than he would like to pay for it, all things considered, that is sort of his habit, his comfort level, his feeling of safety. He doesn't want to zoom off at 5.1 for the first stretch after the stoplight, but he does really want to have safety and comfort. Now, I mention all this because, you know, we've been talking, does price at the pump influence people? Probably, somewhat. It did for a while, bring a waiting list, and maybe still does for the few Prius cars that are available, or other hybrid cars, and people are mentioning this. We've had testimony from Jim Woolsey in our committee that the hybrid cars that we're now driving will be obsolete. The President himself went to see the battery factory in which somebody may produce the technology for the first plug-in Prius or whatever else people have. And the President mentioned yesterday in his remarks off the top of the head, 40 miles somebody could get in this community. I could drive from my home to the Senate office building and back, which is about all the driving I do in a day, and never use a drop of gas. So that's very attractive. And as you said, about 90% of driving may be mandatory anyway, so that for those situations we're obligated to do. I'm trying, I suppose, and this is the purpose of the hearing, to say that all of this does not really take into consideration any of the hidden costs that you have illustrated, whether it is climate change, disruptions that are huge, or the strategic predicament that we have here. Now, I want to zero in on one of the strategic predicaments, and this really has to do with the thoughts that you had, Mr. Kopulos, on the armed forces. Now, you point out just historically that in 1983, the implicit promise to protect Persian Gulf oil supplies became an explicit element of U.S. military doctrine with the creation of the United States Central Command, CENTCOM. And their official history makes the point clear, you point out. And I quote, "Today's command evolved as a practical solution to the problem of projecting U.S. military power to the Gulf region from halfway around the world," end of quote. Now, you point out then they further have refined the doctrine by saying, without oil, our economy could not function. And therefore, protecting our sources of oil is a legitimate defense mission. And the current military operation in Iraq really is a part of that mission. To date, supplemental appropriations for the Iraq War come to more than $251 billion. This is supplemental appropriations on top of our regular military budget, an average of $83.7 billion a year. As a result, when other costs are included, the total military expenditures related to oil now are $132.7 billion annually. That is a big figure. Now, it's not reflected in terms of our market economy. The automobile companies have to make their own strategy. So do the oil companies. What I've suggested in the New York Times story is a strategy to use technology for so-called performance and safety, not for what we're talking about today with regard to disruption or the oil economy or what have you. Some oil companies, but not all. I've cited just one because it's a very large one, would say our job is performance for our stockholders, first of all, those who've invested in this place. And secondly, it's to try to think about the future, and that is getting more of whatever we sell. Now, as maybe a sop to people like ourselves discussing this, we'll do a little bit of research on the side and genuflect in that direction. But that is very long term, not this year, intermediate, or so forth. We're oil people. That is still, I'm afraid, the prevailing view among major players in this. What I'm trying to figure out, and I'm certain Senator Biden shares this thought, how do we get a recognition that our military doctrine, our national defense, now commits $132 billion a year to the protection of Middle East oil lines, not just for us, but for everybody else, for that matter. I don't see this coming through. It's sort of buried in the supplemental. They don't have an account for oil there, nor is there a mention of 1983, which is now 23 years ago. Now, some have pointed out, and I think you in your paper even go back to Franklin Roosevelt and his original meeting with the Saudi king, in which essentially this is the assurance that came. If you produce it, we'll protect it. Now, you know, Americans have not only spent money, but they've lost a lot of lives defending all of this. And that is not reflected in the market situations that we're talking about today. And I think one of the emphasis of this from a foreign policy strategic standpoint is how do we reflect that? That was why I sort of raised the question, do we make an explicit foundation or endowment in which we set aside so much? Because simply to add $1.50 to the price of a barrel or a gallon or so forth may not make it. It may be that my friend who was in the article says, I still want the comfort of my truck. So in terms of a market choice, I'm not sure we get there. And I'm not certain strategically, maybe some administration will come along and say, listen, folks, this is what our doctrine costs, $132 billion a year, explicitly, plus whatever lives we lose, whatever risks Americans take to keep all this going. Do you like that or not? We don't have that kind of a... The issue is, as Senator Biden says, our constituents saying, why don't you guys do something about $3 gas? What are you just sitting there in Washington, fiddling around? This is the big issue out here. If I had $1 for every a Republican banquet I've attended in which people in February, March, or whenever a crisis occurs, come to me and say, you know, why aren't you doing anything about that? Whatever you said tonight was... Add
$1 for the Democratic banquets, too. We'll both be rich.
That's the politics of the country. Why? Because the public recognition of this problem is at that point, the $3 at the pump. They pay it, but they're irritated. And they think that we ought to perform and get it down. Now, we can say theoretically that's a part of the problem. It goes up, down, is forgotten. People go through a set period, but then they get over it. But here you're looking at climate change, which keeps sort of going on inexorably, you know, whether we're having this discussion or not. Or disruptions, you've illustrated those in your paper, Dr. Huntington, that are actual facts. Plus, you know, the huge problem that might have occurred in the Saudi refinery if the terrorists actually had gotten down the road and disrupted 13% of the oil supply that day. You've indicated we could have as much as a 5% loss in GNP. Well, we don't have 5% gain in GNP now. That takes us to a negative figure. That takes us a huge unemployment in our country, which the same motorist who wanted the comfort of his van is unemployed. And then the whole agenda of this government changes. How do we bring compensatory payments, safety nets, retraining? What in the world do we do at this particular point? Whatever is on these charts today is sort of forgotten, but it shouldn't have been, because this is the reason we got to that point. So, you know, what I suppose we're looking for you not to substitute for us as politicians and to try to think through what legislation, resolution, whatever we offer, but as a practical matter, how do we translate the wisdom of this testimony into measures that give us some protection? Maybe this endowment or this insurance policy, maybe the fact that we try some element of pricing that is different than we do without getting into all the political hazards that Joe Biden has discussed so well, namely, woe to be to the person that just suggests putting a quarter on it. They say, why? Or the thought that you do a little bit more each year, that is even worse still. Because you invite a congressional candidate or a president to come along and say, we've had enough of this kind of stuff. I'm going to reduce your taxes. And we're not going to take a look at a long-term feature. So can anybody sort of give a little essay off the top of the head on this? Dr. Huntington.
Well, this will really be off the top of my head, but let's give it a try. One of the ways I look at this hidden cost component, I mean, one way is to look at it as though it should be a tax put on people's purchase of gasoline. And I actually agree with Gary that you won't see a lot of effect of that in the first few years. The real effect you see is in the types of vehicles that people buy eventually later on. They may not get it, but the people who are selling the automobiles realize that they need to be more efficient when they produce the automobile. So I really think that would happen. But step back for a minute. Let's say we've just decided that's not the way we're going to go. We have to go through another policy, another approach. The one way I look at this hidden cost is it's a measure of how much you should do in an area. Suppose you want to discourage gas guzzling vehicles in some manner, or you want to encourage a substitute fuel for gasoline. What it should tell you is that you shouldn't go above. Suppose that Gary and I agree on a number, $10 a barrel or something like this. It should tell you that you should not go above that level. If you're trying to give a subsidy or something like this to somebody, you shouldn't, or we're trying to put in a disincentives for people to use gasoline, you shouldn't make it more costly than whatever that number is. And I think that's one way to look at that number. So it's not anything, it's not a formal account that you would have, but it should tell you that you shouldn't be looking at very large policies above that level. And I don't know if that helps you thinking about the issue a little bit, but I think that's one way I think about this.
Cameron, can I not amend, but add on to your point and maybe add this to the mix? It seems to me that American business and industry is much more sensitive to price than the consumer at the pump is to price. If in fact the major businesses in my state or small businesses in my state realize they can add literally a penny or 2 pennies to their bottom line by economically shifting to another source of fuel, they'll do it, in my experience. They're much more price sensitive. Even though they pass on the price, they're much more price sensitive because they're competing than I think the consumer at the pump is. But again, this is above my pay grade here. That's why we're having this hearing. If that's true, and even though that's a smaller percentage of the market that consumes energy in America, has anybody thought about strategies that deal with that smaller percent of the market where you won't get as big a bang for the buck, but there will be more likely to embrace the change that takes place, the incentive offered or the disincentive? And I know that's not how we think about it, but has there been any studies done? Have you fellows looked at that? And the last piece is that it seems this hidden cost that the chairman is in putting together this hearing, have you all speaking about, breaks my staff just pointed out that DuPont companies recently saved $2 billion in energy by cleaning up climate emissions for them. I mean, to them it's a big deal. But anyway, in the hidden costs, there seems to be 2 hidden costs that they fall in 2 categories that the American public could understand. One is the hidden costs relating to environmental costs. The other hidden costs are relating to defense cost. It seems to me the public is much more attuned and believes that the defense costs are more real, apparent, and immediate than the environmental cost, even though I think they know and they think that there are environmental costs. But one of the things we all say in one form or another, I don't put words in the chairman's mouth, but I say, does anybody think we would be in the Middle East if in fact we were energy independent? Would there be any American out there willing to, give their son or daughter's life out there if in fact we thought that we didn't need anything that the oil oligarchs had to offer? They get that pretty quickly. So as you think through the things that we can or should be doing, and the point you just made, Dr. Huntington, that whatever we do, the price of accomplishing this greater flexibility can't be so high as to discourage that effort. What about focusing on the smaller end of the consumption continuum here, that is industry? And what about a strategy relating to making the defense piece a more palatable or understandable argument as an incentive to change behavior?
I'll leave it to folks to talk about the expense stuff, and I don't have the defense stuff, and I don't have specific references with respect to your business question, but the notion of providing the appropriate incentives for businesses to take a longer-term view of what their energy costs are going to look like is the part of the persistent and increasing business. And if you look in my statement, there's a sentence that said, it almost doesn't matter where you start it. You can actually even separate it from the social cost of carbon. What you need to do is get it in there, get the train out of the station so that people, as they make these decisions, begin to take it into account. With respect to its being small, over the long term, it might not be to the degree that it influences infrastructure decisions and large capital decisions that businesses and governments take. That we will define the energy structure of the United States through 2060 by 2025. We will determine the energy structure of the United States through the end of the century by 2050.
Right.
We're locked in, and so if we haven't, we haven't fiddled on that margin, we're stuck for a very long time.
What are some of the things you could do to fiddle on the margin?
Let me think about that.
Well, that's what we have to do.
Yeah.
See, I mean, when it gets down to it, we have to come up with concrete, specific ways to fiddle. I mean, it is. It's not like we can't generically talk about this, assuming the federal government has any role to play in affecting this behavior.
The bill that's being discussed in the Energy Committee, which has this sort of ratcheting permit price idea, that was vetted last spring, I think, and I think they're talking about it again, is an attractive idea. And frankly, the $5 or $7 or whatever they're picking out for a ton of carbon isn't fixing the climate problem. But that it goes up at, I don't think it goes up fast enough, but it goes up at a nominal rate of interest, and there's a ceiling that's a little bit too low, and things like that in terms of the incentives that you want to create. But maybe the fiddling is in the specifications of how that evolves over time to make sure that it's persistent, predictable, and maybe invulnerable to political manipulation every 4 years.
Let me just say, picking up on the word fiddling that my colleague used, a couple of provisions in one bill that I and several others have offered says that all the cars produced in America ought to be flexible fuel cars within a 10-year period of time. I don't know why it really couldn't be within a 2-year period of time. That's about $100 adjustment in terms of the cost of the car. But it does at least give American motorists the same options Brazilian motorists now have and have had for several years, as a matter of fact. And it does make possible then the practical notion of some amount of ethanol, whether it be corn-based, sugar-based, or cellulosic, or however one wants to get along with those projects. The other thing, which probably is our ballywhack and difficult to do, is somebody, at least close to the president, because we think this is a prime emergency, that coordinates all the missing pieces of this. And without going into laborious detail, for instance, in my state, and I suspect that's true in Delaware, there we are encouraging people to produce ethanol right now from corn, and that we have got one place to start up in 1983 in South Bend. There'll be two more places producing, hopefully, in November, if the construction season goes well, and about 5 more the following year. And there are now 27 places, single tanks in Indiana, where you could use E85, that is 85% ethanol, 15% petroleum. This out of several thousand tanks. Now, the dilemma here is that suddenly life is never simple. The demand for ethanol has increased so much that USA Today points out in many places it is higher than petroleum-based. And you say, well, how can this be? It's supposed to be 50 cents lower. This is the incentive. Well, it can be because MTBE is being substituted by people in California and New England, long distance away from Indiana. But suddenly, at the very moment that we think about making these substitutions and trying to get flexible cars built fast enough, Ford's pledged 250,000, General Motors likewise 250,000. Suddenly, we're not sure there is any ethanol to buy. And my point is that when I go back to my state, I say, well, who is managing this whole thing? Well, it turns out some volunteer organizations. One lady working out of her living room in Mooresville, Indiana, has more control over this than the governor of the state or the president of the United States, in large part because we don't take it seriously. That there is not really any leadership focus in all of this, despite all of the pledges for people to do something. So when I'm talking about fiddling at the margins, as opposed to the big picture, we're really thinking on the ground now with some things that have some small alleviation. And I pick up your point, I think you made it, Mr. Koplis, that we ought to begin thinking in a foreign policy way about our hemisphere. Now, the Brazilian ambassador came to visit me the other day. He's probably visited with Senator Biden and others. And he said, and we could furnish a lot of ethanol to you right now. The president, just to be provocative, told a small group of senators this in the White House. You know, how about, well, my goodness, here you have people on the Ag Committee, and I've served on that distinguished committee, and they say, not on your life. You know, we have a sugar policy. There will be no amendment to the Farm Bill through 2007. As a matter of fact, we're not sure we want to see a change in 2008, 2009. You know, leaving aside all the emergency we're talking about today, Americans sacrificing their lives or whatever, sugar comes first, or whatever it happens to be in terms of our vested interest. You know, this is the sort of the niggling business that we're dealing with, but it's very serious. And this is why the big picture you present is helpful to us for people who do take this seriously, which I think most of our colleagues do when they are sort of confronted with this. But I'm still back to, I think, Senator Biden's plea to you for suggestions for legislation, enactments, speeches, you know, action steps that may come from this conference today.
Well,
yes, sir.
We've given a lot of thought to that and actually have been very involved. We put together the first alternative fuel vehicle program at the Department of Defense in 1990. So, and I have done some work with the Tank Automotive and Armor Command up in Detroit, actually Warrenville, Michigan. But there are some things we can do, and what we need to do first of all is to understand and recognize that the American people are practical. If you say, you know, go do this, it'll do X, Y, or Z, they'll go do it. And there are some real simple things. I think your suggestion on having all new vehicles be flex fuel is excellent. There's no reason they can't do that next year. All you're doing is changing one chip and some fuel lines. It costs $100 in the factory. You could even, I would even go so far as to say give a tax credit to let people retrofit it. But when you do, you've got to make sure that Detroit doesn't turn around and void their warranties, because what's been happening is that people who might want to use more, they say, well, that's fine, but under our warranty, if you use more than 15% or 20%, it varies by manufacturer. Your warranty is voided, and if your engine goes bad, it's all on you. A second thing that we can do, and the Department of Defense has this 21st Century Base Program. The idea is to make bases sustainable in terms of their own energy. Now, one of the things I suggested is, under the Energy Policy Act rules, federal vehicles are supposed to be, by now, 80% alternative fuels. They managed to get around that by buying the flex fuel vehicle and not using flex fuels, but we need to solve that. But one of the other things is, why not put E85 pumps, since they're supposed to be using it anyway in their civilian vehicles, at military installations, post offices, to fuel the government vehicles, but then have them available to the public. One of the problems you've got now is infrastructure. If you want to use E85, or where do you find it? Well, there are military and government installations that have fuel depots in every city, in every region of this country. You could very quickly begin to do that. Now, once you did that, what's going to happen is, the Exxons and BPs of this world are going to go, well, wait a minute now, I don't want them buying that from the government. You know, God help us there. So you're going to see those cropping up at regular fillings. It's the same thing happened with diesel in '73. You couldn't find a diesel pump to save your life in '73. Along came the boycott. They had to literally give out books with, this is where the pumps are, these truck stops. Every gas station you pull in today has a diesel pump.
Let me just interrupt by saying that we've tried, in a statesmanlike way, to write letters to all the major oil companies suggesting that they might want to put E85 pumps on the premises of stations that they have in our country. The letters that I received back usually point out that they understand I'm well motivated, and there's some salutary remarks.
You're a good man.
Genial or whatever. But at the same time, let's get real. There were impurities with E85. To mix that stuff with what we're doing would just be terribly disruptive, to say the least. And furthermore, those who are most negative on it are not really sure that this alternative fuel business is not just a fad. It's almost like the spike to $3, but we'll get over it. So, therefore, to get serious about this, they're not prepared to do that. I have yet to get a single favorable response from any oil company that would put a single tank out there. I went out to Terre Haute, Indiana last July to see the very first tank put aside two alternatives, with a sign in the middle of the road that showed the ethanol would be $1.50 or something of that variety, as opposed to $2 at the tank that was next to it. And there was a speedway racer driver there, and said we're going to use that at the speedway, and so that was helpful. And 200 people and the mayor. It's a big for one gas tank. But that doesn't mean that it's a spread like wildfire. The 27 I'm talking about are not on major oil company lots. They are mom and pop variety stores, who, as a matter of patriotism, have decided to do this, and many are losing money for the reasons that I suggested. The ethanol is going to California to solve MTBE, and the number of flexible fuel cars coming in Indiana we can trace by the hundreds per month, not by the thousands. That's the real-life dilemma that we face out here in these sort of situations. And I just mentioned this because you know this, but as you write more about it, and I hope that you all will, reflect, if you can, how we solve the political problem. I think, clearly we have some opportunities, and we'll write again. And Senator Biden and I hope to be more persuasive as we do that.
30 seconds to reinforce your point. Our colleague, Senator Carper, when he was governor, shifted all state vehicles to alternative fuels, made the farmers in my state very happy. They thought that was a good idea. People thought that was a good idea too, but they can't go anywhere to get it except to go to a government-sponsored facility, and they're not able to do that, to the best of my knowledge now. So,
why can't they do that?
Well, I think the answer is I don't know. Whether it's insurance, or there's not availability, or the physical access. I'm not sure what the reason is, to be honest with you, until it was raised a moment ago. I mean, I don't know I don't think it's a policy prescription, but I think it's just I simply don't know, to be honest with you.
The answer is really pretty. That's why we say put it on the fence line. The answer is really pretty simple. After 9/11, They restricted access to military bases to people with an ID card, retired or active. I happen to have an ID card, so I can get on. If you can't get on.
This is state-owned, it's not a military
Oh, okay,
facility.
well, a lot of times
Yeah,
states
but
also,
state, similar.
they'll restrict.
I assume that's the reason it relates to, and the argument about, access to, insurance, covering anything that happened to citizen come. I don't know. I truly don't know, but it's worth my finding out now that I've raised it and acknowledged I don't know.
Well, that's amenable to a legislative fix, just like the warranty issue. But getting back, if I can, for a second to the base 21, I had said in my testimony that the fact that 2/3 of our oil is used in the transportation sector means 1/3 isn't. We really need to look at that. And there are a couple of things. For example, there are several, but one technology I'm aware of because I've looked at it recently that takes waste wood, turns it into a fuel oil that's perfect. For a perfect replacement for number 6, 0 sulfur, 0 NOx, and so on. The company is Canadian right now. They're taking all of the dead wood from the pine bark beetle infestation. They're getting ready to convert that into oil substitute. It is an oil, actually. We have a clean forest program. We're taking enormous amounts of dead wood out of the forest and we're piling it up. And guess what? It's a fire hazard. Instead of piling it up, you could take that, all of that, and convert it into oil. And the nice thing about this particular unit is it'll handle 400 tons a day economically. It's economic in that size, which means that you can put a lot of little ones around our public forests, take all that oil, all that wood, which right now we're paying $20 a ton to haul away, and I don't know what we're paying to get rid of it after that, or at least have it in dumps, and turn that into a boiler fuel that's so good that Alcoa in Canada has agreed to buy every bit of this they can get because they had environmental problems with their stacks and their smelters, and this is going to lower emissions enough that they can meet Canadian standards.
Yes, sir.
This issue that we've been talking about over the last, for most of the morning, I think really comes down to whether people have the perception that these problems are real or not. And actually that's an issue that people at Stanford are beginning to look at, not myself, but other people who are trained in thinking of people's psychology and so forth, and how do they learn about these problems. And so hopefully they'll come out with some interesting, useful information. As I think about the problem, and I admit it's a very simplistic way of thinking about it, but it seems to me we're successful in putting in sulfur dioxide, fees on sulfur dioxide emissions a number of years ago. And what's different about that as compared to a gasoline price or gasoline tax is the gasoline tax, the consumer sees it directly, where the sulfur dioxide emissions, the utilities squabble about it, but they basically they make the adjustment and then they charge the electricity price to the consumer, and the consumer, for the most part, I mean, I haven't really checked my bill that carefully, but I don't think I actually see a fee there so much for sulfur dioxide. But it's they're not as aware of it, and so it seems to me, following up on kind of a point that suppose you took Gary's suggestion of a very small tax initially that would rise gradually. If you put a fee in there that wasn't so visible, but did affect anytime anyone used fossil fuels, it affected a fee that was based on the carbon content, and you could almost make that work much like the sulfur dioxide emissions, and it wouldn't be quite as a direct charge that people wouldn't be coming up to you at cocktail parties and saying, "Why did you raise my fee?" I noticed in the automobile sector, the one thing we have done is the corporate automobile efficiency, the CAFE standards, and the fuel efficiencies. I think that measure also works in a similar way. It forces forces automobile companies to make more expensive automobiles, perhaps, than they want to, if particularly on that segment which it has to meet those standards. If you combine that CAFE standards with a little more flexibility, I think the National Academy of Sciences actually proposed something or wrote about it as a possibility of putting in the trading of credits that would allow people to focus their attention on those vehicles that really could meet the standards more less costly than others. you could, again, it wouldn't look like a tax to people at the outside. In fact, it really isn't. It's kind of it's really a cafe standards, but it allows, it has the nice advantage of being, having the flexibility that a tax would have. Those kinds of policies are ways of more or less not hitting the consumer full on, saying you are going to pay a higher tax, but it's a way of implementing these policies that perhaps could be done. I mean, it certainly has been done on other types of problems. I don't know whether you can do it with gasoline.
Well, we thank all three of you for your very thoughtful papers and the facts that you have included, which will be a part of this record and which we will try to transmit to our colleagues, and ask for your help in responding to additional questions that we have or other members who are not able to attend. And so we have as complete a hearing record as possible for those who are interested in this subject, and we hope that many are. But I thank each one of you for your preparation and for being so forthcoming in your responses.
Gentlemen, thank you very much.
Thank you.
The hearing is adjourned.
Yeah, please. You have my card. Yeah,